I was born in Zambia and moved to Western Europe before I started school, did my primary school there, and returned back to the continent when I was ready to go to high school. So I've had the opportunity to live in different parts of the world and immersed in different cultures. And that is really where my interest in what I do comes from. I have decided to title the speech, the presentation as Positively Understanding the Dynamics of Doing Business in Africa. And I say positively understanding because there are many things that we look at when we look at the continent, but we always look at them from a very negative perspective, simply because we do not understand the context where they come from. FDI in Africa is increasing, thanks to, over the past few years, a very hungry, resource-hungry China. And that has contributed quite a lot to Africa's growth. In some countries, some of their extractions are bought by China 5 years in advance. That may be a good thing, but that's also quite a risk, because as China's economy began sort of taking a slip, it began affecting those African countries who had a very large reliance on exporting resources to China. But there's also something taking place on the continent with regards to China, and that is the Chinese normally invest at the very high level, but they also come in and invest at the very low level. The Chinese will come in with laborers. The Chinese will come with, at one time in Angola, there were 145,000 Chinese living there when there was a lot of construction taking place, because they come in with everything. And this led one leader on the continent to say, we need to make a distinction between investors and infestors. The next point that I want to add, and that's not ignoring the very positive role that China has played in Africa's development. The next point I'd like to add is something that is emerging again, where they say the West invests in Africans and China invests in Africa. Now, what is the distinction? If you look at Chinese companies, when Chinese companies come into Africa, the top structures, the entire management, and everyone, they'll all usually be Chinese. And as we said earlier on, including laborers if it's in the construction. So the Chinese invest in Africa. If you look at the major Western companies, IBM, Coca-Cola, you mentioned them, they will invest in Africa, but if you look at their management structures and so on, there will be a very good pool of talented people that are given opportunities. And so it's not a fallacy that, as of now, China invests in Africa and the West invests in Africans from an investment perspective. And that's a very important distinction for you to make. If we look at the demographics, in 1950, Africa was just 9% of the world's population. By 2050, Africa will be a quarter of the world's population. And by 2100, Africa will be 39% of the world's population. So Africa is growing in significance. And for those who are in the consumer world, in the retail world, in telecoms and so on, this is a continent that you need to track very carefully. This is a continent where a lot of your long-term strategies will have to be defined and refined. And if we take the population projections beyond 2100, which is where I ended, Africa actually overtakes Asia as the most populous population. And so beyond 2100, unbeknown to many of you, the most populous continent in the world is going to be Africa. I want to touch on just a little bit on the political trends. The number of military coups in Africa has reduced significantly. They are no longer acceptable. There was one that was attempted in Guinea a few weeks ago, and it was very quickly crushed. The higher levels of education have led to populations that seek a lot more accountability from their leaders. So people are not just more accepting, they want accountability from their leaders. Social and electronic media have played a very important role. They are exposing a lot of things. And the fact that you aren't able to track who's behind social media has made it very easy for people to have a tremendous amount of courage. And so people have built a lot of courage because they are able to do things without the risk of being arrested. Military forces are becoming a lot more professional and neutral. They refuse to be used by certain governments. In the past, military forces would do what the government demanded. Now, military forces stand back and allow their governments to be deposed. It happened in Zaire, it happened in the Ivory Coast, it happened in many other countries where when the government became repressive and the people rose up and the government gave instructions to the military to suppress the population, the military said, no, we will not do it. And that's a very key trend. Coming back to the title of more expressions of discontent, when we see discontent on the continent, we will tend to look at it negatively and tend to look at it as a form of instability. It's actually a very, very positive thing. Because in the past, people were so bottled up, were so frightened to do anything, they hardly expressed themselves. They hardly showed any discontent. They didn't have the courage. Governments were so repressive. And now people are beginning to stand up. And when we look from the outside, without the context, we look at this and we say, this is negative. It is actually very positive. The number of ruling parties that have lost power on the continent has increased. It started in October 1991 in Zambia when the then President Kenneth Kaunda gracefully handed over power. It was the first time in Africa that it had happened since the independence era. And when he lost elections, the military went to him and said, we are asking you to declare a state of emergency and suspend the outcome of these elections. His response was, I will do no such thing. And that is why he continues to be such a respected figure. But what was important about what he did is it set a trend. Malawi was next, and so on. And you now have ruling parties on the continent that lose elections. Before 1991, it never happened. We have some socioeconomic challenges continentally. One of them is the lack of diversification in our economies. You have countries like Rwanda and Botswana that have, and a few others, that have done a very good job in trying to diversify their economies. Many more are coming up, but our economies are not diversified enough. The risk to that is that if 50-60% of your economy relies on a particular commodity, if you are the DRC and copper makes up a substantial amount of your GDP, when the price of copper goes down, it affects everything else. The lack of political succession planning remains one big concern, but it is improving. Capital flight used to be around 40%. It's now at about 30%, more or less the same as that of the Middle East. And this signals a growing confidence in our domestic markets. The brain drain, I have a slide on the brain drain because I think it's going to touch on a lot of aspects here, and I expect quite a few questions on that, especially as it pertains to this particular conference. Now, military coups used to take place on the continent, as I alluded earlier on. Was it such a negative thing? When we look, we will say, yes, it was negative. But let me share a slight analogy for you to make a decision on whether it was actually negative that military coups took place in some places. In one country in West Africa, which was a one-party state. Now, the one-party state, for those of you that didn't know how they operated. A one-party state was whereby on the election, on the ballot, there was only the name of one party and the face of one leader. And next to it was yes or no. So you either put your tick next to the yes or next to the no. And in one particular country, the president, after an election, got 100%. And one of the ministers was asked to say, are you saying that every single person here in these elections ticked yes on the ballot? And the minister says, no, not at all. Some ticked yes, and some ticked no. And so the question was, but if some ticked yes, and some ticked no, how is it possible that the president got 100%? He says, oh, you don't understand. This is just a matter of interpretation. Those who ticked yes were saying yes. They want the president to continue. Those who ticked no were saying no. They don't want a change of president. So the president got 100%. Now, people got so frustrated because they had no outlet. And people ended up saying, what is the point of us attempting to change our government through the ballot paper if it's going to be interpreted in the manner in which the government wants it to be interpreted? We call it the Stalin formula. When Joseph Stalin took over, you all recall he ran a very repressive regime, and one day one of his advisors ran to him and he says, it was just before an election, and he says, Mr. President, these new policies that you're introducing, are you not worried that they are going to affect us in these elections which are just a few months ago? And a very relaxed Stalin says, I can see you're still very wet behind your ears. Never worry about how people vote. Just worry about how we count the votes. So that is the historical context of military coups. And sometimes there's this perception that countries in Africa just loved launching into military coups. There was a context. There was a context which many people don't understand of how those military coups actually ended up taking place. Africa's brain drain. I'm told a lot of you here are people in HR and training, and I think this is going to be particularly relevant to all of you. In the last 25 years, we've lost 20,000 full professors of all disciplines. That figure excludes associate professors, senior lecturers, and lecturers. If you add those, the figure of 20,000 goes significantly higher. And that's only in the last 25 years, and that's in all disciplines. 10% of our finance and IT people are lost to Africa each year, every single year. There are more African engineers and scientists in the United States and Western Europe than there are in the whole of Africa put together. Did you know that? Now you know. The skilled manpower that Africa loses each year in terms of training, what we spend on training, we lose each year. We spend 3.4 billion rands each year that we lose. In other words, all the people that we lose each year that leave Africa, their combined cost of the training has cost us $3.4 billion. That is each year. But it gets worse. After losing that 3.4 billion, we then spend an additional 4 billion recruiting approximately 150,000 expatriates annually to come and fill the very spaces of those that we had just trained with the 3.4 billion. And so training costs that should cost us 3.4 billion each year end up costing us 7.4 billion. Which brings me to one question. And I would like us to discuss it in one of our panels. Given some of these, and I must say that when I do this presentation, because it's very, very loaded, this discussion, when I talk to boards, managements of companies and so on, I usually take over 2 hours. So I've really tried to compress everything as much as possible, because there's really a lot. But given just some of what I've shared now, I want to ask you all a question. Is it true that Africa has a skills problem? Or is it true that Africa has a skills retention problem? Do we have a training problem, or do we have a retaining problem? And that's a question I want to leave with you, given just some of this that I've shared. And I can share a lot more along that line, but I just summarized it. Of the world's 60 poorest healthcare systems, 36 are in Africa. And yet, on a per capita basis, we are the largest net exporter of doctors and nurses. And what's even more painful is that we need doctors and nurses more than anyone else, but we export them more than anyone else. It comes back to the question that I asked. And why the question is important is because a lot of companies spend a lot of their national strategies trying to address a problem of training, and they never solve the problem. And when I speak with government officials, I often ask them, but are you really addressing the right problem? Has it never occurred to you that you're not solving this problem because all your strategies are geared towards resolving a training problem, when your problem is actually one of retention and not one of training? But these trends are beginning to reverse. Economies are growing, there are more opportunities, improved governance. Some people run away because they don't like how their places are being governed. And as governance improves, people begin returning. And an important thing, dual citizenship, which many of you will take for granted. And I've got a slide on that, and I will show you just how important dual citizenship is as a development tool. Many of you look at dual citizenship as a piece of convenience. It is a lot more than that in the globalized world. We have archaic citizenship clauses, and these have major economic implications. And they have major economic implications because if you are a citizen of South Africa and you end up living in the US and you qualify for US citizenship, and South Africa does not allow dual citizenship, and you have to choose between US and South Africa, the human mind will always choose where there are greater opportunities. In this case, you would choose the United States. What are the economic implications for that? It means the money you make in the US, you will be reluctant to invest in South Africa because of your questionable legal status. No one wants to invest in a country where their legal status is in question because they are not sure about the security of their investments. And so you may originally be South African, but you'll find it difficult to invest in South Africa. When Ghana introduced dual citizenship, investment from the Ghana diaspora became its #1 FDI in 5 years. Overtook everything else. So in a globalized world, dual citizenship is a valuable tool for investment. And in the days to come, it will be an important contributor to economic growth. Sadly, in Africa, out of 55 countries, only 20 at the moment embrace dual citizenship. And if you think that's little, in 1973, 0 embraced dual citizenship. We are now at 20 out of 55. That number needs to be improving. It's slowly coming up, but that means less than half of the countries in Africa actually allow for dual citizenship. And what they are beginning to realize that it has a major impact on their economic growth, especially in a globalized world where people are moving around and working and settling in different places. I asked the question of training versus skills versus retention. Where we do have a problem in the days to come, and what we need to address, and this is relevant to all of you here, is in tomorrow's world, there's going to be a direct correlation between the innovation in a society and its economic growth. Why is that? In the past, the most important commodities were either gold, silver, or some other commodities. When I'm asked what the most important commodity is going to be for tomorrow, I always have the same answer. The most important commodity in tomorrow's world, in a globalized world, is going to be an intangible, is going to be innovation. That is the most important commodity in tomorrow's world, innovation. Those countries and societies that will be able to innovate will see the positive impact on their economic growth. Those that are unable to innovate will suffer the consequences. Where do we as Africa stand in terms of innovation? One way of measuring innovation is to say, of all the people that graduate in that year, in the university in that country, what percentage of them are engineers? Because that's where the innovation comes from. In Africa, and these are figures as of now, I'm taking a continental statistic, 3% of all the graduates each year are engineering graduates, 3%. And I want you to have that figure in mind. In the US, it's 6%. It's come down from 8 a few years ago. In Europe, it is 12% of all the graduates each year are engineering graduates. In China, it is 40%. 40% of all the graduates each year in China are engineering graduates. We stand at 3%. Now, a lot of you here are decision makers in that training environment. And those are some of the things that you need to address. But we can't just address universities alone, because before we address universities, it starts at the high school level. Before we address the high school level, it starts with the very training of the teachers. It goes back to how the teachers are trained and the kind of skills that they themselves are given, that they are then able to impart on their high school students, so that we have more that are equipped and have more of an interest in getting into engineering. So it's a whole series, but that's where we are. We're at 3% in Africa versus 40% in China. I think that story, you can work so many things into that story, but it's something that we need to address. And I included these details specifically because of the kind of audience that this is. Now, I want to get into perceptions. And with a lot of my client companies that I take to different parts of the continent to explore business opportunities and so on, I sort of usually ask them to say, what are your perceptions on the continent? So these are real life perceptions that I'm sharing. They are not thumbsuck. And I stuck to just the top 7. There are other perceptions, but I just took the top 7. And what are those? Business executives in South Africa normally think that the rest of the continent, doing business on the continent, is risky. They think it's politically unstable. And I've touched in very briefly on some of the context of that instability, just for you to see it differently. They think it's politically unstable. They think it's corrupt. They feel that it has poor corporate governance. The people are unprofessional. They are very bureaucratic in their conduct. And they are unreliable legal systems. I don't see, when I look at your body language, I don't particularly see anyone saying, I disagree with that. Correct? I don't see anyone disagree. But you see, each coin has two sides. Would you like to know what they think about you? Again, I stuck to the top 7, and these are real perceptions speaking to the other side. They think South African companies are inflexible in their approach. They come to a country and they say, this project, this is how we do it in South Africa, and this is how we are going to do it here. They're impatient and pushy, domineering, impersonal and poor interpersonal skills, arrogant, not knowledgeable about other African countries, societies, and cultures. South Africans only know about South Africa. And even then, within South Africa, they only know about their own culture, let alone the cultures of the country. How do you expect them to know about the cultures of the rest of the continent? This is what they say. These companies have no respect for locals. The way they treat locals is often very contemptuous. I see very muted body language. That's what they think. But what are the implications of this? The implications of this, I say to them, is when you come here, you need to spend the first few minutes through your conduct disproving all those things, disproving the corruption issues, disproving all those things, disproving your unprofessionalism. Because that is when you walk in, that is what they expect. Likewise, when you're a South African executive and you're going there and you walk into that boardroom for the meeting, from the moment you walk into that boardroom, before you even sit down, those 7 things, that's what they've summed up of you. You may not be like that, but that's what they think of you. And so that's important for you to know because it helps you in how you're going to conduct yourself in the nature of your relationships and how you deal with them. Now, I'll talk about some cultural differences. In the West, you do business, and based on that business, you eventually become friends. And for purposes of interpretation, South Africa fits in with the West. The culture of South Africa, the corporate culture of South Africa, is that of the West. So in terms of this, South Africa fits into the West. In Africa, you become friends, and based on that friendship, you eventually do business. What does that mean? And that was said by Kenneth Kaunda to Harry Oppenheimer in the 60s. South African companies are usually impatient. It relates back to the previous slide where I talked about being pushy. You need to spend more time in building the relationship. A lot of times, South African companies feel that you take one trip and you come back with a decision. And your business development executives, even in terms of how they evaluate the people that work under them, they need to make sure that the kind of targets and timelines that they've established are not mechanical, but are Africa realistic. That means providing more time for business development work. That means allowing that friendship, and you need to allow those scales. And don't look at it mechanically to say, to do this takes 6 weeks on average. That doesn't work on the continent. The other fundamental difference is that in the Western world, power is positional. So, you hold an influential position, you will be influential. In Africa, power is personal. Your decision-making in the Western world, boardrooms and cabinet meetings are used to discuss decisions and make decisions. On the continent, a lot of times, those decisions are discussed and made elsewhere and brought to cabinet or brought to the board to be formalized. And you need to understand that in terms of your own business development aspects. The paradox of Africa is that one needs to evaluate it in a manner that is not conventional. When you're using economic measurements, the conventional economic measurements do not work in Africa because the informal sector is such a large proportion of the population. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to rush through this. And of course, one of our biggest businessmen on the continent has said that Africa's risks are mainly perceived, which is what I was trying to tell you. In a nutshell, if you look at Africa as a prickly pear, the prickly pear is more delicious than the apple or than the banana. It's a very delicious fruit. And Africa is more profitable than Europe, than other continents. It's a prickly pear. But getting it is quite a mission. You need to mitigate your risks. You need to do all kinds of things. You also need to understand that you get pricked once in a while. But for those who understand how to mitigate risks, for those who understand how to be patient, for those who understand that once in a while you will get pricked, this is the delicacy that awaits you. More delicious than an apple or a banana, more profitable than Europe or the United States.